You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme. With only 2 weeks to go before the global climate summit, America's ambitions are under threat from one of the president's Democratic colleagues. A Ford factory in Merseyside is to become the company's first site in Europe making parts for electric cars. And why the government's advisors say carbon capture is key to the UK reaching net zero by 2050. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. Now, we're just 2 weeks away from the start of COP26, the global climate summit that many say is the last chance for leaders to commit to action that will stop the climate crisis. But ambitious steps the US president wants to take to tackle climate change head-on are under threat from one of his own Democratic Party colleagues. Well, while Joe Biden races to get his plans past Congress, the way the event has been organised is facing criticism, as our climate change correspondent Hannah Thomas-Peter reports.
2 weeks to go until the COP26 UN Climate Summit in Glasgow. It's been described as the world's last best hope to limit global warming, but there may be a big problem looming. When we spoke to US Special Envoy on Climate Change John Kerry earlier this month, he commented on the stalling progress of a bill that contains a sweeping plan to decarbonise America's electricity. At that point, he was still confident.
The sausage making is not pretty, but in the end, they're going to have a sausage, I believe. And my hope is that it includes the critical components of what we need to be able to deal with the climate crisis.
But that is now in doubt because of this man, Senator Joe Manchin, a Democrat from the coal-reliant state of West Virginia who wields a decisive vote in the Senate. He is refusing to support the Clean Power Plan, and it may be withdrawn. Suddenly, the United States, a global leader in the fight against climate change, urging other nations to do more, looks like it can't follow its own advice, with potentially huge consequences.
It makes it more difficult for the U.S. to push China and other countries to do more towards net zero emission reduction targets in mid-century if China and those other countries can say, you've set a target, but you're not making progress towards implementing it, which they've already put out as a defensive shield against the pressure on them to do more.
America's domestic political problems are not the only issue the government's COP26 unit in Westminster is having to consider at the moment.
It's emerged that some of the summit's main corporate sponsors, including Sky, have previously written to the government raising concerns about the way it was being organised. And activists are complaining about ongoing problems with the availability and cost of accommodation, which might prevent them from attending.
In a statement, a COP26 spokesperson said, "We are committed to hosting an inclusive summit in 2 weeks' time, which showcases innovative work from a range of businesses and civil society groups who are committed to tackling climate change together. Ministers are continuing to focus their time on helping to secure a positive outcome in Glasgow." Organising an international summit is not an easy task, and at this crucial moment, as nearly 200 nations, each with individual needs and pressures, prepare to gather in Glasgow, delivering a successful one will be even harder. Hannah Thomas-Peter, Sky News in Westminster.
A Ford factory in Merseyside is to switch away from making parts for petrol vehicles to making components for electric cars. It's won government funding from a £500 million scheme, which is part of the Prime Minister's Green Industrial Revolution. Helen Ann Smith has more.
So this is clearly good news for the people of Merseyside, and in particular the 500 or so workers whose jobs are going to be secured into the coming years and hopefully the coming decades as well. That factory moving from making gearboxes that go in internal combustion engine cars to making these new electric power units, components of electric cars. And a big financial investment in that plant as well, in excess of £200 million, and a big chunk of that has come from the government. It's come from the government's Automotive Transformation Fund, which is essentially a big pot of money put aside not only to incentivise these manufacturers to push their electric lines, but also to make sure that they don't lose out in the process, because of course we know that by 2030 these manufacturers are not going to be allowed to sell petrol or diesel cars anymore. So in a sense, I think that fund is working. We know it's also benefited Nissan, Vauxhall as well in the past few months. But in terms of making sure that there's more green cars, more electric cars on our roads, it's not just what happens in the factories that matters, but it's also what happens in the streets, because there needs to be the infrastructure to support it. And there's another piece of research out this week from an organisation called New Automotive, which has essentially collated a lot of the data around this charging network and just how good it is, just how robust it is to support the transition that's going on. And the message from them, I think, is really that there needs to be a bit more urgency and a bit more speed in terms of upping that charging network. At the moment, there's around 24,000 charging stations in this country, and they estimate that by the middle of next decade, there's going to need to be about 250,000. Last year, around 27 a day being installed. They say that needs to be upped to around 40 or 50 a day if we're going to be meeting those targets. So a big overhaul is underway. Yes, an overhaul in manufacturing, and that's important, but there needs to be a broader infrastructure overhaul as well.
In some of today's other climate news, the former US Vice President and environmentalist Al Gore says he believes a majority of Republicans are in favour of decisive action on climate change, and that young people view the climate crisis as a problem that must be solved regardless of political agenda.
Young people are leading in my country and in every country now. So I think the landscape is changing quite dramatically. And there is now a growing demand from the grassroots activists, regardless of political party. And I think that's going to make a big difference in the elections ahead.
The first £5 million winners of Prince William's Earthshot Prize have been announced, a scheme in Costa Rica paying local citizens to restore natural ecosystems, and Coral Vita, a company growing coral 50 times faster than traditional methods, were amongst the winners. The prizes will be awarded every year for the next 10 years to Earthshots, which are ambitious ideas to help biodiversity and tackle climate change. An invasive tree species is causing water shortages in Cape Town in South Africa. Specialist crews are removing 54,000 hectares of pine trees, which are using around 55 billion litres of water every year. South Africa's timber industry relies on these trees, but the seeds are easily dispersed from plantations to protected nature reserves, putting local flora at risk. Now, the UK's ambition to achieve net zero carbon by 2050 focuses on using more renewable energy. But the government's climate watchdog is warning that this target is unlikely to be reached without greater use of carbon capture and storage technology, which is still untested at scale. Our economics editor, Ed Conway, reports.
Somewhere in the North Sea, miles off the coast of Scotland, a revolution is about to take place. Oil and gas fields, which once pumped fossil fuels out of the ground, are now promising to help solve climate change. It is a remarkable, controversial claim, but it goes to the very heart of the race to net zero. To see why, we need to chase these underwater pipes connecting the rigs and oil fields back to where they meet land.
This is one of the main pipelines taking natural gas from the North Sea all the way through into the grid. So 10 to 20% of what goes into your boiler, into the electricity system, it's passing right under my hands. But that is only the start of the story. Because the plan is to take carbon dioxide from various industrial processes, pressurise it, liquefy it, put it into this pipeline and send it down under the ground into the North Sea. That, at least, is the idea.
Gas is coming from the North Sea. It's been cleaned up and it's been sent into the national grid to go to everybody's homes around the country. I think in 30, 50 years' time, you're going to see still that process continuing, but what you'll see is, in reverse, a carbon capture and storage facility, which is then sending the CO2 that is captured from this gas offshore to make the gas effectively carbon zero. And there will, in addition, piggybacking on all of that will be the manufacture of hydrogen, which of course is a net zero fuel.
But you're probably wondering, isn't this just another way of fossil fuel companies carrying on extracting fossil fuels?
That's a really important point to stress, that even at net zero, we will continue to need or industry will continue to need oil and gas, and CCS is a technology that actually helps us reduce the emissions from those industries that still require oil and gas.
So how does carbon capture actually work? Well, there are all sorts of industrial processes, power stations, cement manufacture and so on, that create carbon dioxide. At the moment, most of that carbon just gets emitted out of the chimney. The idea of carbon capture is to take those fumes and run them through a special unit which removes the CO2. The carbon can then be stored under the ground in places like depleted oil and gas fields, as is planned in the North Sea. Or it can be put to use in other industrial processes like chemicals plants. That, at least, is the plan for this, the Acorn project at Fergus gas terminal. Except, as you can probably see, it is still just that, a plan. Which brings us to the main thing you need to know about carbon capture. Without it, all those plans to get Britain's greenhouse gas emissions down to net zero won't work.
Have you got any of those scenarios that don't rely one way or another on carbon capture?
No, is the short answer. We have actually looked at this question. So in December, we published 5 different scenarios for getting to net zero. Each of them did include carbon capture to varying degrees. We did have a scenario without it, but interestingly, it didn't quite get there.
So without carbon capture, it's impossible, is it?
It's not impossible, but it's much, much harder. I think it can be done, but it does rely ultimately on the government putting some big policies in place, some of them quite expensive. And for me, that's the bit that's missing at the moment.
Then there's the second big issue. It's never been successfully implemented at scale. Travel the country and every so often you encounter the ghosts of carbon capture past. Here is one at the old Longannet coal-fired power station in Fife.
There was a whole scheme. It was going to take all of the fumes out of that chimney and get rid of all of the carbon. Then in 2011, it was cancelled. It was too expensive, and the power station is now being dismantled.
And further north in Aberdeenshire,
Peterhead gas-fired power station spent millions of pounds on a carbon capture storage project, cancelled in 2015.
So what's different this time around?
The key difference, Ed, this time is the government's legal commitment to achieve net zero emissions across the whole of the country. The only way that you can achieve that, particularly in these hard-to-abate industries, is to do carbon capture, use and storage.
This is a furnace where you're burning natural gas.
Another difference is that the technology has improved. Actually, the main innovations behind carbon capture have been around for decades, but new startups like Carbon Clean say they can do it much more efficiently. Their rig, the blue one here, can do the same work, maybe even more, as that enormous contraption behind it.
This you can call miniature version for a furnace or a power plant,
Okay.
where you are burning natural gas and going straight away to a carbon capture plant.
So it's going through all these pipes and it's ending up with your machine here.
Correct.
Where does the captured CO2 come out?
And it releases from the top from there.
The CO2 is just released into the air, is it?
Yeah, at present it is released into the air.
Okay.
In other words, even here at the very cutting edge, we're not quite there yet. With the clock ticking down to 2050, we're still a long way from big projects that actually capture carbon and store it. And even leaving aside the concerns about perpetuating fossil fuel use, not everyone is convinced.
Until we get to the point where there is a case for deploying carbon capture from a commercial viewpoint, carbon capture will not happen.
In the coming weeks, Tata Chemicals will open this, the country's first and biggest industrial carbon capture facility, using that CO2 to make sodium bicarbonate. And Sky understands the government is poised to announce funding for a swathe of projects, potentially including the Acorn scheme in St Fergus. But as world leaders prepare for the Crunch Summit in Glasgow, it is clear that for this technology and the environment, time is of the essence. Ed Conway, Sky News.
Well, joining us now to discuss the climate issues of the day are the author and broadcaster Zaya Tong and Director of Union of Justice, former MEP and Mayor of Sheffield, Majid Majid. So welcome to both of you. Good to see you both. So let's start with that issue of carbon capture and storage, shall we? And capturing carbon dioxide emissions before they're allowed out into the atmosphere to contribute to global warming is what, in a sense, the holy grail of climate solutions. And the head of the Committee on Climate Change, as you heard in that report, says more investment is crucial if the UK is going to reach its net zero targets. But are we relying too much on unproven technologies? Well, Zaya, what do you make of this? So the government's advisors there saying carbon capture has to be part of the mix if we're going to reach net zero. So do you accept that it does have a role to play?
It may have a role, but I think that the state that we're currently seeing, it is playing a minor role. I want to give you an example. There's several different types of carbon capture technologies. One is called direct air capture. We recently saw the launch of a facility in Iceland called Orca. Now, that facility was able to suck up about the equivalent of 800 cars only per year in terms of emissions. Put another way, if you imagine all the emissions that we release in a single year, it sucks about 3 seconds worth. So even if you had 50,000 of these plants, that would be the equivalent of sucking up about 50,000 small villages worth. Now, on the other hand, when we look at something like Project Drawdown, they have listed over 80 working solutions that we have available to us today. And in sum, it works out to, if we actually started utilizing the solutions that we have on hand, drawing down 1,583 gigatons by mid-century. So we would be able to reach around our 1.5 goal by 2050 if we actually use the available technologies that we have.
What do you think, Majid? I mean, obviously, the ultimate goal would really be to stop putting emissions out into the atmosphere anyway, but we need solutions to capture them, don't we? I mean, let's just take a look at what one scientist has said here. Trees can't absorb enough CO2 to stop climate change on their own. It's someone from MIT. You'll see it in a minute anyway. No matter how many we plant, that's what they've said. So, Majid, shouldn't we just be doing everything we possibly can to try to reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere? And carbon capture is one of those things that we should be trying.
Of course, we should be trying everything, but of course, we need to kind of have a set of priorities. So, for carbon capture and storage to be viable and increase, in carbon capture capacity by a factor of 35 by 2030 is really required to kind of meet the Paris Agreement goals. But of course, this is highly, highly unlikely to be achieved, as it takes about 6 to 10 years for carbon capture storage projects to complete to begin with. But not only that, and there are only, I think, currently about 20 or so projects in development worldwide, which really isn't quite enough. And of course, yes, carbon capture it's a good technology. It captures more than about 90% of CO2 from power plants and industrial complex. And yes, it kind of course, constantly, it kind of reduces the environmental impact of the energy sector, but it is ridiculously slow in rolling out. And of course, the amount of money being thrown at it and investment in carbon capture and storage can, in my opinion, really compete with investment in renewable energy projects, which, in my opinion, should be taken a higher priority. And just finally, because in the IPCC in 2018, they kind of found that 89% of global CO2 emissions actually came from fossil fuels and fossil fuel industry. So, instead of trying to play both sides, and what I think we really need to do is to understand and accept that there is really no future in fossil fuel dependent economy. So we urgently need to transition away from using dirty fossil fuels. So of course, as much as the government wants to spend a lot of money in investing in carbon capture, that money could be better spent on actually renewable energies to begin with.
But Zaya, even if that's the priority, to move to renewables as fast as possible, there is still that period of time when you need to rely on fossil fuels during that transition, isn't there? And carbon capture can play a part there, and not least around those industries for which there aren't really solutions yet for reducing the amount of emissions there are.
Well, here's something that's rather tricky. As Majid just said, there's about 20 projects currently in play when you're looking at the oil and gas industry. But if you actually look at what they're doing, they're capturing a lot of that carbon, and it's being used in a process called enhanced oil recovery. And what enhanced oil recovery is you're taking that carbon and you're pumping it into oil reservoirs as a gas in order to do what? In order to boost oil production. So this, for me, is a situation that is not particularly workable.
OK, and Majid, do you think, looking more broadly, we're putting too much faith in technology that's largely unproven at this stage, or not even invented in some cases, to solve the climate crisis generally?
Of course, the government can say they definitely need it in terms of their plans, but there's so much else that we could be doing. We can focus a lot on transport. Like, it would be great for our government, and if they were to halt any expansion of airports and introduce a frequent flyer levy, that would be a great thing. Even when we kind of look at power, like, our government, in my opinion, should also really pull out all the stops through finance and regulation to really double the speed of renewable energy rollouts instead of, importing dirty energy from elsewhere. So it's, of course, I get it for them. They're saying that it's a priority for them that they need to do, but in hindsight, they need to be a bit more ambitious.
OK, let's move on to our other topic of the day now, shall we? Because the royal family is making a habit of appearing on our programme. From Prince William's Earthshot Prize to the Queen overheard criticising global leaders for their lack of climate action, to Prince Charles and his decades-long campaign on environmental issues. But their green credentials have also been called into question. So are they good role models for climate action or not? Well, Zaya, what do you think? I mean, the family undoubtedly has a very high profile. I mean, they're known around the world, not just in this country, of course. A lot of their members have used that influence pretty positively on climate, haven't they?
They absolutely have used their influence positively, but I want to say I did a little bit of fact checking, and I looked at the royal family's carbon footprint for the year 2019, according to Statista, looking at their gas, electricity, and their transport. This family emitted 8,282 tons of CO2. Now, I want you to compare that to what the average UK household emits. That's 17 tons only. So you have one family emitting over 8,000 tons, another family emitting 17 tons. I just ask you, is that fair?
OK, and Majid, what do you think? I mean, just to say, let's just quote Chris Packham for a second. He said this is a very powerful family. They have a very powerful voice and they want to do something very powerful. They could do something very powerful for the environment. I mean, do you agree that they are likely to be influential? And people will hear what they say, but will they follow what they do? I mean, how relatable are they to most people, do you think?
Great question, and in all honesty. And of course, like, I welcome anybody with any cultural influence in any shape or form to actually talk about the climate and actually get people talking about it. But I can't help but feel that the monarchy, the royal family, is being a bit hypocritical. Like, it was recently reported that the Queen had actually lobbied the Scottish government for an exemption from environmental protection laws, which was actually there to design to cut carbon emissions. But not only that, Prince Charles, of course, he's done lots of amazing things, but at the same time, he kind of last year flew 125 miles by helicopter just to make a speech about aircraft emissions. So, of course, on one hand, it's great that they are talking about it, but like you said, for their message to really hit home, they need to lead by example and not, in one case, just telling us what we should all be doing and what other leaders should be doing, instead of kind of looking inwards so basically they can lead by example.
OK, Majid, Zaya Tong, we're out of time, but really good to see you both. Thanks very much indeed.
Cheers.
So that's everything from us for today. Do join me tomorrow on the show to discuss all the big climate issues. We'll be carbon footprinting expert Mike Berners-Lee and Judy Ling Wong, Honorary President of the Black Environment Network. So thanks for watching and we'll see you next time.